course, history adventures. Today I'm going to take you back to the origin stories of South Carolina and the origin story of Charleston itself. So we have picked a no better location than Charlestowne Landing State Park. This is actually encompassing the original settlement that was here. We'll talk more about that as we get on through the rest of the video. However, if you guys decide to come out to Charlestowne Landing, which I do hope you do, it's a lot of fun to come out here and really kind of explore the original location of where we set up at. But one of the things you need to be aware of is even though they have a zoo out here, we also have wildlife out here. And every now and then, you'll run into one of the guys that you really don't want to mess with. For instance, take a look at this sign posted at the very front of the park. I think you guys understand what I'm talking about. There's alligators out here. There's also snakes and other creatures, and let's just do ourselves a favor. Let's leave those animals alone while we're out here. This is just not really the place to go herping or to go looking for all these wildlife. And if you can't identify the wildlife of the low country, you may just end up messing with something that you didn't plan on messing with. But while we're out here, I'm not going to show you everything to do with Charlestowne Landing. I'll just show you bits and pieces of it, things that I find interesting. And if we find anything cool along the way, maybe one of those bits of wildlife, I'll end up showing those to you as well. But without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so in order to take us back into South Carolina's history and back to the very beginning, I really need to take you across the Atlantic Ocean and back in time. I need to take you to 1625 in England when King James I passes away. Now, King James will lead the throne to his son. His son is Charles I of England. Now, Charles I will very quickly become most likely one of the most unpopular kings in English history. As the story progresses, you'll kind of understand why. Now, one of the things that he did that most of the British people weren't really fans of is he married Henrietta Marie of France. She's a French Catholic girl, and England is at a time period where, honestly, they don't like the French, and they're really trying to separate themselves away from the Catholics. That doesn't mean that there's not Catholics in the country. There are, but a lot of Protestants are rising up in England at this point. So, in 1625, Charles I takes the throne, and he begins telling people that the kings have the divine right to rule, which means that he opposes Parliament. Now, you can imagine the English people have had Parliament and representation for several generations at this point. They're really going to be reluctant to give it up. So, Charles I is adamantly opposed to Parliament, and he keeps doing things without their permission. He keeps enforcing taxes that they have not actually agreed to. He keeps telling Parliament that they are basically irrelevant and that everyone should do whatever the king wants them to do. Again, he believes in this divine right to rule. So when the English Civil War begins, what it ends up being is a war between Charles I and his loyalists and the parliamentary armies of both England and Scotland. Now, England and Scotland at this point are acting as allies with one another, but they're also acting as kind of their own separate nations. So we fast forward in the war a little bit to 1645, and what we find is that the Scottish will end up capturing Charles I. They're going to hold him captive for a couple of years until finally they work a deal with England, that England will give them 100,000 pounds in currency and agree to pay more in the future if they were to hand over Charles I. So they do exactly what they expect them to do. They take the 100,000 pounds and the promise for more money in the future, and they give Charles I to the English Parliament. Now, Charles I will end up being executed in 1649. In January of that year, he was put on trial for treason. Around January 27th, he was actually publicly tried, at least publicly announced guilty. And then January 30th of 1649, Charles I will be executed. Now, immediately after Charles I's execution, you can imagine there's a struggle for power over in England. One of the men who's struggling for power is Oliver Cromwell. Now, Oliver Cromwell was a parliamentary member. He's also a part of the English military at this point. And he is really going to be trying to set up a new style of government. Now, the style of government that he wants is basically what he calls a republic. But with the way he's going to run it and the way that the parliament that exists at that time is going to run it, it's not exactly a republic, if you will. Over the course of the next several years, from 1649 up until about 1653, there's a lot of struggles for power all throughout the British Isles and through Ireland. What we're going to find is Oliver Cromwell is going to go and he's going to fight for power here. He's going to end up launching campaigns against Ireland. He's going to launch campaigns against Scotland, and one of the big reasons he's going to launch one against Scotland is because Scotland has just declared in 1649 that Charles II, the true heir to the throne, is now the King of Scotland. Now, Oliver Cromwell is going to go and oppose that, and one of the men that's going to help him is going to be very important to our story later on. His name is George Monk. He's going to go and help fight in Scotland. Now, ultimately, George Monk will become the governor of Scotland, mainly due to these endeavors. But later on, that's going to put him in a position of power to really help change England. Now, in 1653, after all of these rebellions, if you will, are kind of settled down, Oliver Cromwell is named the Protectorate of England. So he's given the title of Lord Protector. He's going to keep that title up until his death in 1658. Now, when he passes away, his son, Richard, will attempt to take his father's place, but he's very inexperienced and ultimately is not going to be a very good ruler for England. Now, some of the lords of England are going to decide that this is enough. They want to bring back the English king. They also want to bring back the old school style of parliament. So they reach out to Charles II, who has been exiled to France. It is viewed as highly unlikely in 1658 that Charles II is going to be able to return to his throne. The reason being is, well, Richard is in power right now as the Lord Protector, and even though he's completely incompetent, you still have Parliament to deal with as well. So George Monk, who we discussed earlier, will send an army from Scotland down to London. When they arrive, they will demand that the Rump Parliament readopt the members of the Long Parliament, and after they've been readopted, they end up dissolving Parliament as a whole. And for one of the first times in English history for the past several years, we're actually going to find an election for Parliament. Now, once this new Parliament stands up, this is the exact groundwork that we need for Charles II to arrive. And in 1660, on May 29th, on his 30th birthday, Charles II arrives in Dover. So after Charles II arrives back in England, one of the things he's going to do is he's going to immediately agree that he's going to co-rule England with Parliament. He's also going to give a pardon to nearly all of Oliver Cromwell's supporters, with the exception of a few key ringleaders who he's going to absolutely put to death if they had not already died. He is also said to have desecrated the remains of Oliver Cromwell. Now, when he's coronated, which means that he's officially recognized as the King of England and the rightful ruler to the country by the people, it also says that the church is going to recognize him at this point. He ends up saying thank you to all these people and all these lords who were responsible for putting him back on his throne. One of the ways he's going to do that is, starting in 1662, he's going to begin issuing land grants and land charters depending on the situation. Now, one of those land grants becomes South Carolina as we know it today, but the Carolina colony will be established through a land grant gifted to 8 lord proprietors. Now, these 8 lord proprietors include men such as Edward Hyde, George Monk, who we've talked about several times, William Craven, John Berkeley, his brother William Berkeley. We also have John Colleton, we have George Carteret, and one of the most famous ones here in Charleston, Anthony Ashley Cooper. If you visit the city, you'll find that the rivers that split down both sides of our peninsula are called the Cooper and the Ashley rivers, so named for Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper. From 1663 until 1670, word is going to reach places such as Barbados. They're advertising the new Carolina colony with land to be given away if you can get here. So in 1670, some of the sons and daughters of Barbados set sail. They arrive here at Albemarle Point, which is where Charlestowne Landing State Park sits. The view behind me is the view that they would have seen as they came in, minus all the buildings that you may be able to see in the horizon. But this is the Ashley River. They're going to sail up the coast and into the Ashley River, and they're going to arrive at Albemarle Point. When they get here, they're going to start building their small settlement. The settlement, I'll walk through briefly in a moment, was surrounded by a palisade wall. They're going to help defend themselves from the Spanish, from hostile Native Americans, and from wildlife. The style of boat back here behind me is called a kedge. Now, this isn't the style of boat they would have used to actually come here to the colonies, but it is the style of boat that we would have used to transport goods up and along the coast. So behind me, you can see the style of palisade walls that would have been built around the settlement. Now, of course, these are not the original palisade walls, but archaeologists did dig down, found out where the palisade walls would have once stood, and they stand on the same location today. Now, the city, well, correction, the village at the time, the settlement that we set up, would have absolutely needed to be guarded. Palisade walls would be one way to help with that, but you still need a militia to man the wall. The militia that we would set up would not be supported by the king, not supported by the British Army, but made up of the settlers themselves. Pretty much any able-bodied man was going to serve as a member of the militia. Now, for the most part, they're going to keep law and order and peace in the settlement, as well as protecting it. But let's say you violate some of the laws and you disturb the order. Well, there's only one thing we can possibly do with you, and that's make sure to put you in the stocks. Behind me, we can see one of the other defenses that they would have used when they first built up the settlement. Basically just earthen mounds that in between each mound would have been placed a cannon. That's in case an invading force came up from the river where I was just at and started to attack the settlement itself. This would be able to help them kind of fend off a little bit. And other men would have been waiting behind those hills with potentially things such as their muskets, maybe bayoneted weapons, swords, whatever they had available to them at the time, whatever the lord's proprietors had helped provide to them. The style of house that's behind me is the very style of house that would have been built here when we first built this settlement. Now, of course, this is not one of the original houses itself. This is actually just a reconstruction of the houses that would have been out here. Just kind of give you an idea of what this style of house would be. Now, I don't know how my camera's going to react as I go through the actual dark portion of the home, but you may be able to see at least a little bit of it. Would have actually been a very modest style home. You would have had nothing more than just a hearth on one end, maybe a little countertop to prepare your food on, obviously cooking over the hearth itself. And on the other side, we had a bed or two, a little table for everybody to sit at, and upstairs typically would have been some kind of storage. Now, it really depends on the individual household, but if they had horses or anything like that nearby, if they didn't have a barn yet, maybe they stored a little hay up there. But I would be more than willing to bet that most of the family's belongings and some of the food stores were put up there. So the first settlers again arrived in 1670, but after about 10 years, Albemarle Point really isn't going to work out for us. A couple of different reasons for that. We discovered that we're going to need to build a large port system. Albemarle Point is just not very conducive to building a large port. It's surrounded by marshland rather than deep access to the river. We are also getting malaria out here. And today, we understand that malaria, or mal-area, means bad air. We also understand the mosquito is actually the carrier of malaria. So malaria itself is actually being carried by the mosquito, and mosquitoes aren't real fond of breezy areas. Now, this area that we were suggested to go to by the Kiowa Native Americans is called Oyster Point, or as we would also call it sometimes, White Point. It was a peninsula just across the river that we had sort of avoided when we first arrived, but it turns out to be the best location, and ultimately that's where Charleston sits today. All right, well guys, that wraps things up for today. Make sure that you go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit that like button on the video. Definitely let me know that you love the content that's going on. If you feel like leaving a comment down in the comment section, go ahead and do that as well. Tell your friends about us, and hey, stay tuned for the next video. But as always, check twice, save a life, and take care of each other. Till next time, y'all have a good one.